Those true eyes, too pure and too honest in aught to disguise. The sweet soul shining through them. Welcome to part 4 of my doll portrait sculpting series. In this sculpting tutorial, I teach how to sculpt the eyes. This is CertainlyCaroline with more Polymer clay fairy tale nonsense. If you haven't already, you might want to check out the first 3 parts, but don't feel like you have to. If you have been following along, you know I ended up scrapping my first face. I found the best way of learning art is definitely by doing it and then redoing it. When you think of your mistakes as just one of the steps in the creation process, then scrapping something doesn't feel like a waste of time. It actually feels like you're progressing. It feels good. I normally sculpt large eyes, doll eyes, so my eye proportions aren't correct. So if you're going for realism, you'll want the eyes to be 5 eye widths across the head.
Hello, lowly people with boring hats.
I prepare the eye sockets for the eyes by pushing into the clay with my large ball tool. I'm pushing pretty deeply because I'm going to be putting a ball of baked clay in each socket. If your face isn't as deep as mine on your sculpting board, no problem, just cut your ball of baked clay in half and then push each half into the eye sockets with the rounded side facing up. Obviously, if you tried to do this with raw, unbaked clay, you'll squish the eyes while inserting them into the eye sockets. So be sure to bake the eyes first, and then also be sure to set them in very carefully because it's kind of easy to gouge the face if you're not real careful while you're pushing the baked clay into the raw clay. Some things to keep in mind. This kind of goes without saying, but get the eyeballs lined up properly on the face. You don't want one lower than the other one. And make sure your balls of baked clay are the same size. Also, each eyeball needs to be set at the same depth, of course. So pick up your board and look at the face from all angles. Take your time with this, because if you get this part right, everything else kind of falls into place. All obvious tips, but they're also kind of easy to overlook if you're not mindful of them. Oh good, it's time for eye anatomy. I'll start with the obvious, the upper and the lower lid. Each corner of the eye is called a canthus. The lateral canthus lies in close contact with the bulb of the eye. The medial canthus is prolonged by a triangular space called the lacrimal caruncle. The lacrimal caruncle is the small pink node at the inner corner of the eye. Lacrimae is Latin for tears. Remember Lake Lachrymose from Series of Unfortunate Events? It means lake of tears. Remember the leeches? I thought I was going to put in a picture of leeches here, but I love you guys, so I put in a picture of coffee with a heart in it sitting on a polka dot tablecloth instead. The eyelids slant upward just slightly, by about 2 millimeters if you're human. If you're a fairy, your measurement would be different due to your small size. So technically speaking, notice that the medial canthus is usually lower than the lateral canthus, but not always. It's good to get familiar with anatomy so you can identify the anomalies. However, it's always best to study your subject and do what you see, not what you think you see. And be mindful of bone structure while sculpting the eyes. The eyes are protected by some protruding skull bones. You've got the frontal bone above the eyes, the zygomatic bone protecting the outer side of the eyes, and the maxilla under the eyes extending to the nasal bone. These bones create the hills and valleys of the eye sockets, and they deserve the careful sculptor's attention. I place a small pancake of clay onto the baked eyeball for the upper lid. I just flatten the clay between my fingers. Remember to work with clean hands. And I do the same thing for the lower lid, only my clay shape is more of a snake than a pancake. Since this doll's eyes are pretty deep set, I need another larger pancake of clay for the lower lid to transition to the cheekbone with the right thickness. I gently smooth out the clay with a series of light strokes. Using my medium-sized ball tool, I indent slightly Sometimes there's a crease on the lower lid and sometimes there's not. I start this process all over again for the other eye. I was wondering what inspires you guys. I guess I get most inspired by other artists. Pinterest is incredibly inspiring to me. I have a miniature fairy tale world that swims around in my head all day and it's just waiting to be created. So I pin art dolls and I pin fairy tale photos and these miniatures. I just go, oh, I want to create this. I want this thing to come to life. I am wondering what inspires you guys to spend hours sculpting. What makes you really want to create? Now you get to decide how wide open you'd like the eyes to be. You probably want both eyes to be the same. However, if you study the faces of a group of people, sometimes one eye is more open than the other. I tested that thought by getting online to find a picture for you guys as an example and shifted through a lot of faces. Usually it depends on what the eyebrows are doing and what the mouth is doing. So when there's just a little smirk in the mouth, then the eyes aren't open evenly. And same goes with the eyebrow when it's up a little. But sometimes the person isn't even smirking or the eyebrows don't even seem to be different. And yet one eye is more open than the other eye. And it still looks natural. Really, it's the iris and the pupil that you've got to get exactly the same when you paint them. In my process, I paint on the iris and the pupil. And yes, it is kind of tricky to get it exactly the same. Maybe I'll come up with a trick or something for you guys when I do the tutorial on how to paint a doll face. So all that to say, the lids don't necessarily have to mirror each other, though usually they do. I get to work on the lacrimal caruncle now. It's oddly satisfying. You get to poke and prod and create this little node on the inner corner of the eye, and somehow it brings the eye to life. So it's just kind of an easy thing to do, and it brings so much realism to your eye that you're like, ooh. So now when people ask you, what's your favorite part of the face, you can say the lacrimal caruncle, of course. I just filmed these on my iPhone, so I can't get very close up without it going fuzzy. So I do apologize for that. Someday maybe I'll get a really nice camera and I'll be able to do a tutorial just on the lacrimal caruncle. Wouldn't that be something? Now that the eyes are coming along and looking better, you might notice that the face is a little wide or not wide enough, and so you can either add or subtract clay. That's one of the reasons I like to make the face before I make the head. I felt like the frontal bone needed to be built up a little bit more for Michael, so I just flattened some clay in my fingers and smoothed them onto the forehead. I use the dental tool to deepen the crease above the eyes. For some reason, my mind gets kind of cloudy as far as what the outer corner of the eye looks like. I think that might be because the eyelashes kind of cover that up. And then the inner corner of the eyes, of course, are very visible with the lacrimal caruncle just sitting right there in the corner, hanging out, doing its thing. Speaking of, I get out a needle to put some final touches on the lacrimal caruncles. Just need some of those valleys deepened, and those lines are very fine, so needle works well. Anyway, so what I was saying was the inner corner of the eyes are very visible, but not so with the outer corner of the eyes. I would recommend looking in a mirror or looking at the reference photo real carefully. And when you're looking at that reference photo, check out the frontal bone structure and the zygomatic bone to really piece together that outer corner correctly. Okay, that's about done. Now I use my blade and I will put it in the oven. Oh dear, I almost forgot Michael's beauty mark. We gotta get that on there. If you haven't watched part 1, at this point you'll want to go back and watch that to learn how I attached the baked face to a baked ball of clay. I did not make a tutorial about how to sculpt ears for this series, but I made one about a year ago, which is still good information for today. I'll put the link to that here and in the description below. Also, since Halloween is coming up, I thought I'd make a 2-part tutorial featuring this spooky miniature street lamp, and then get back to the doll portrait series in November when I go over how to paint the doll face. Okay, that's pretty creepy. Why don't you just do that for the Halloween tutorial? If anyone is still here, you are amazing. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing? You gotta subscribe! And you gotta leave a comment. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. Thanks for watching, you guys.